The mirror cracked in. The quiet corners of life, where love grows comfortable and routine becomes ritual, some cracks remain unseen until the light strikes just so. This is the story of how one man, devoted for a decade, uncovered the truth hidden within those cracks and found strength in the shards. The first whisper of doubt, James Lockwood was a man of patterns. For 10 years, he had loved and lived alongside his wife, Elena, building a life together that felt as solid as the foundation of their home. Sundays were for long walks, Tuesdays for takeout, and Fridays for laughter over shared bottles of wine. It was a life he believed in, until the laughter on one Friday evening didn't feel as genuine. He noticed the small things first. Elena's eyes darted more often to her phone, her lips twisting into smiles that didn't include him. She'd grown distant, her laughter less hearty and her touch lighter, like a ghost of its former self. James, ever trusting, brushed it off. She's stressed, he told himself. Work has been rough. But the whispers of doubt grew louder. A strange discovery. It began innocently enough, as such things often do. One evening, James was searching their shared office for a pen when he found an envelope tucked beneath a pile of papers. Inside was a receipt for an expensive dinner at a restaurant he had never been to, a place they had once said they'd visit together. Elena must have gone with her colleagues, James reasoned. But the unease lingered. When Elena returned home that night, he asked casually, "How was your meeting today?" Her response was smooth, practiced even. Exhausting, but productive. James wanted to believe her. He needed to believe her. The phone that spoke. The defining moment came 2 weeks later. A notification buzzed on Elena's phone while she was in the shower. James didn't mean to look, but the screen lit up with a name he didn't recognize. Chris. The message was brief but damning. Can't stop thinking about last night. When can I see you again? His stomach churned, and the air felt heavy. Torn between denial and the urge to confront her, James knew he needed more than a single text to uncover the truth. Threads. Unravel over the next week, James carefully observed, his heart growing heavier with each new thread he unraveled. He found unexplained purchases, hidden conversations in encrypted apps, and a change in her usual roots home. It was a photograph that broke him. A picture of Elena at a park, sitting on a bench, her hand entwined with Chris's. A park they had visited many times together. The betrayal felt like a dagger twisting in his chest. The confrontation, James chose a quiet evening to confront Elena. She walked into the room to find him sitting at the dining table, the photo and receipts spread before him. "Elena," he began, his voice steady but thick with emotion, "I found these. I need to know the truth." Her silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Finally, tears brimmed in her eyes, and she confessed. It wasn't just an affair. It was a year-long deception, born of dissatisfaction she had never voiced. "I didn't know how to tell you," she whispered. "I didn't want to hurt you." The irony of her words stung more than the betrayal itself, reclaiming the pieces James didn't rage or shout. His heartbreak was quieter, more profound. In the days that followed, he made the hardest decision of his life, to let go. In therapy, he found clarity. His world didn't end with Elena's betrayal. It shifted, allowing him to see himself in a new light. He rediscovered passions he had long neglected, woodworking, traveling, and the quiet joy of solitude. Elena's absence was a wound, but it was also a space where James could rebuild. The light. Beyond the cracks months. Later, James stood at the same park where the damning photo had been taken. The bench was empty now, the memory a dull ache rather than a sharp sting. As the sun set, casting golden light over the landscape, he realized something. The cracks in his life had let the light in. James walked away, not as a broken man, but as one who had found strength in his reflection. The end. This tale is one of heartbreak, discovery, and resilience, reminding us that even in betrayal, we can find the seeds of renewal and growth. Certainly, I'll weave a story for you that captures the emotional complexity of such a discovery with sensitivity and depth. This tale will delve into the experience of unearthing the truth, the whirlwind of emotions, and the journey that follows. Let us begin. The Dusty Letter Inn, a quiet suburban neighborhood nestled among rows of identical houses. There stood a modest home where James and Claire lived. They were the kind of couple everyone admired. High school sweethearts whose love seemed unshakable, a pair that weathered life's ups and downs together for over a decade. But as the years passed, James noticed something. A distance, subtle but persistent, began to grow between them. It wasn't the kind of rift born of arguments or anger, but rather a silent, unspoken tension. Claire became more guarded with her phone, more elusive with her time. James brushed it off, blaming the stresses of work, of life, of routine. Until one ordinary afternoon, James was cleaning the attic, sorting through old boxes filled with forgotten trinkets and memories. He found himself chuckling at faded photographs, love letters they had exchanged in their youth, and souvenirs from their travels. But beneath a pile of dusty notebooks, he uncovered something unexpected, a small, locked journal. The sight of it stirred curiosity. It wasn't like Claire to keep secrets. After some hesitation, James turned it over in his hands, finding a faint scrawl on the back cover. "For the moments I cannot say aloud." His heart quickened. Should he pry? The idea felt wrong, invasive, yet the unshakable feeling that something was amiss compelled him. He opened it, the lock surprisingly simple to pick. Inside, he found pages filled with raw, unfiltered thoughts. Some were mundane, notes about her day, frustrations at work. But as he flipped through, certain entries began to stand out, their words heavy with hidden meaning. The revelation, it started with mentions of someone named A. At first, James thought it was a friend or colleague, but the entries became more intimate, describing stolen moments, whispered conversations, and lingering touches. The truth hit James like a freight train. The journal chronicled a relationship that had been ongoing for nearly a decade, a relationship Claire had carefully hidden. The name A was repeated in ways that left no room for doubt. His hands trembled as he closed the journal. He felt a storm of emotions, anger, betrayal, confusion, and an unbearable sadness. Their life, their shared memories, all felt like a lie. But James was a man of action. Instead of confronting Claire immediately, he decided to uncover the full truth. Over the next weeks, he quietly observed. He noticed the patterns, the late nights, the phone calls she dismissed with a strained smile, the emails that seemed far too frequent for a simple coworker. Finally, it all came to a head one evening when Claire left for what she claimed was a work dinner. James followed, his heart pounding in his chest. She wasn't at a restaurant. Instead, she met a man in a park, a man who greeted her with an embrace that spoke volumes. The confrontation. James didn't burst out of the shadows that night. He needed to process what he'd seen. When Claire came home later, he sat her down, journal in hand. "Claire," he began, his voice steady but filled with pain, "I need you to tell me about A." Her face drained of color. In that moment, James saw not just guilt, but something deeper. Relief. It was as though the weight of her secret had been suffocating her. What followed was a conversation that stretched into the early hours of the morning. Claire admitted everything: the affair, the reasons she felt drawn away, and her struggles to reconcile her actions with her love for James. The aftermath. The path forward wasn't easy. Trust, once broken, isn't easily mended. James had to decide whether to walk away from a decade of shared history or to try rebuilding what was left. They sought counseling, not to save their marriage, but to understand each other and themselves. Through it all, James found strength in the truth. The discovery, painful as it was, allowed him to confront the cracks in their relationship and in himself that had gone unnoticed for years. In the end, the story of James and Claire wasn't about infidelity, but about the choices one makes when faced with betrayal. It was a tale of loss, growth, and the courage to rebuild, whether together or apart. This story begins not with a tempest, but with the quiet, subtle whispers of intuition, a seed of doubt planted by the winds of uncertainty, watered by the moments you didn't yet know mattered. It is a tale of resilience, discovery, and the quiet unraveling of a decade-long tapestry, each thread revealing truths hidden in plain sight. The discovery. The day began like any other. It was a Wednesday, a day that never promised anything extraordinary. The routine was familiar. Coffee brewing, a fleeting kiss as she left for work, and the hum of everyday life continuing its predictable rhythm. But that morning, the kiss felt different. Perhaps it lingered too long, or perhaps not long enough. You couldn't quite place it, but something about her gaze, her ever so slightly averted eyes, struck a chord that reverberated deep within you. Weeks passed, and the unease settled like a low fog over your thoughts. Nothing concrete, just a sense, a whisper that refused to be silenced. You told yourself it was paranoia, the work of a restless mind. After all, 10 years of marriage should foster trust beyond reproach, right? But the mind is a diligent keeper of secrets, and yours wouldn't let this one rest. The clue it was on a rainy Saturday afternoon, as you were cleaning out the attic, that you stumbled upon the first thread of the truth. Among old photo albums and dusty knickknacks lay a box you didn't recognize. Curiosity got the better of you, and as you opened it, you found what appeared to be a collection of receipts, letters, and photos. At first glance, it seemed innocuous, a record of her life before you, perhaps. But then you noticed the dates, a receipt for a weekend getaway at a hotel you'd never visited together, a photo of her laughing with someone you didn't recognize, the intimacy of the moment captured unmistakably. And then, the letters, short, cryptic notes signed with a single initial. Your heart raced as the pieces began to form an unsettling picture. Confrontation with the truth, determined not to jump to conclusions, you did what anyone might do. You sought clarity. Her phone had always been a shared space, a symbol of trust. That evening, when she left it unattended on the kitchen counter, you hesitated for what felt like an eternity before unlocking it. There, in a folder buried beneath layers of apps, you found messages, years of correspondence with the same individual. They spoke of clandestine meetings, shared dreams, and a connection she'd nurtured in the shadows of your life together. The realization hit like a tidal wave, sweeping away the foundation of everything you thought you knew. The crossroads. You sat in the living room that night, the evidence spread before you like a map to a place you never wanted to visit. When she came home, her expression shifted from casual to wary as she noticed your demeanor. She knew before you even spoke. Her confession came in halting sentences, each word a stone dropped into the deep well of your pain. She admitted to the affair, acknowledging its beginnings a decade ago, a time when she claimed loneliness had crept into your marriage like a thief in the night. The journey forward. The days that followed were a blur of conversations, arguments, and tears. There were moments of anger, moments of heartbreak, and moments of reflection. You sought support from friends, from family, and eventually from yourself. The decision to stay or to leave was yours alone to make, and it was one you approached with the weight of 10 years of shared history. In time, you began to see the cracks that had existed in your marriage long before the affair. It didn't absolve her actions, but it gave you a framework to understand them. Whether you chose to rebuild or to walk away, you found a sense of strength in the process, A reminder that even in the face of betrayal, you held the power to shape your future. This is not merely a story of infidelity, it is a story of resilience, of rediscovery, and of the human capacity to confront even the most painful truths with courage. And while the scars may never fully fade, they became part of the tapestry of your life, a testament to your journey and the strength you found within yourself. A new beginning. The weeks stretched into months, and the rawness of the betrayal began to settle into something more manageable, though no less profound. The life you had known was gone, but something unexpected began to grow in its place, a clarity you hadn't felt in years. She moved out temporarily, giving you both space to breathe, to think, to feel without the pressure of immediate answers. In the solitude of those nights, you began to reconnect with yourself in a way you hadn't since the early days of your relationship. Hobbies you'd set aside for the sake of us found their way back into your hands. A long-neglected guitar, the thrill of weekend hikes, the quiet meditation of sketching the world as you saw it. But amidst the rediscovery of your own identity, questions lingered. Could trust be rebuilt? Did you even want it to be? Unraveling the why counseling became a lifeline, not just for you, but for her as well. Separately at first, and then together, you explored the complex web of emotions, choices, and circumstances that had led to this point. The therapist's office became a place of brutal honesty, where anger met vulnerability and sadness found understanding. "I felt invisible," she admitted one day, her voice trembling. "Like I was living in the shadow of the life we built, not really a part of it." "And you didn't think to tell me?" you countered, your tone sharper than you intended. "You decided to fix it by tearing us apart instead?" The sessions were grueling, each one peeling back layers of your shared history. But they also illuminated moments you hadn't seen clearly before, the times when work had consumed your attention, when conversations had become perfunctory, when you'd both assumed the other would always be there, unchanged. The decision one day, you stood at the edge of a cliff, not a literal one, but a metaphorical precipice, the kind that forces a choice. Rebuilding meant diving headfirst into uncertainty, into the arduous process of repairing a bond shattered by betrayal. Walking away meant forging an entirely new path, one that held its own fears and challenges. You met her at a cafe that afternoon, the same one where you'd had your first date so many years ago. It was a deliberate choice, a setting steeped in nostalgia but also neutral ground. "I've made my decision," you said, the words steady despite the storm raging within you. Her eyes searched yours, brimming with a mixture of hope and fear. And? The two roads, if you chose to rebuild, the path was slow and painstaking. Forgiveness didn't come easily, but it came eventually. Over time, you both worked to create something new. Not a recreation of the old, but a stronger, more honest partnership built on the lessons of your shared past. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and in its own way, beautiful. If you chose to walk away, the journey was one of self-reclamation. The divorce, though painful, became a turning point, a chance to rediscover who you were outside the identity of husband. In time, you found peace in new relationships, new experiences, and the realization that endings, though painful, are also beginnings. The lesson: regardless of the path you chose, one truth remained constant. You emerged stronger. The experience had taught you to listen to your intuition, to value honesty above comfort, and to never take the small, quiet moments of connection for granted. This story doesn't end with a perfect happily ever after, but with something far more meaningful: growth, resilience, and the understanding that life, even in its darkest chapters, holds the potential for light. A false calm months passed after the initial betrayal. Whether you chose to reconcile or part ways, life began to settle into a new rhythm. If you had stayed, your relationship felt like it was on the mend. There were shared laughs again, tender moments that hinted at the love you'd once built. If you had separated, your life had started to find its own steady beat, a blend of newfound independence and the cautious optimism of starting over. But life has a way of twisting paths you think you understand. A new shadow. The police officer entered your lives as a friend, or so it seemed. If you had reconciled, he was a community figure, someone who shared casual conversations with your wife at local events or during neighborhood patrols. If you had separated, he was a neighbor or someone she mentioned in passing, his name cropping up innocuously in her stories. The signs this time were more subtle. Perhaps she seemed more secretive with her phone again, or her schedule became unexpectedly erratic. Maybe it was her sudden insistence that she needed space to find herself, or how she became overly defensive when you asked simple questions. If you were separated, the changes were harder to notice. She no longer owed you explanations, after all, but even from a distance, her demeanor shifted in ways that caught your attention. The clues resurface. The discovery was different this time. It wasn't a box in the attic or a folder on her phone. Instead, it came through whispers, comments from neighbors about how they'd seen her and the officer talking late into the night. Or maybe it was something more direct, an accidental voicemail where their conversation was unmistakable, or a photograph someone shared thinking nothing of it. The pieces began to fit together, and your heart sank with the weight of déjà vu. You wanted to believe it wasn't true, but the evidence was undeniable. The confrontation. If you were still together, the confrontation came with a fury you didn't know you possessed. After everything, after all the work we've done, this? You demanded, your voice trembling with both anger and hurt. Her response was a mix of guilt and deflection. It wasn't supposed to happen, she admitted, tears streaming down her face. I didn't plan this. I felt alive again. If you were separated, the confrontation was less personal but no less painful. You called her out, perhaps for the sake of closure, or simply to understand how someone could betray trust not once, but twice. She tried to explain, but her words felt hollow, a justification for actions that had no defense. The deeper betrayal, this time, it wasn't just about infidelity. It was about the patterns she'd refused to break, the promises she'd shattered, and the trust she'd never truly earned back. If you had reconciled, it felt like the ultimate betrayal, undoing all the effort and vulnerability you'd poured into giving her a second chance. If you had separated, it reinforced the painful truth that she wasn't the person you once thought she was. The final chapter. This betrayal marked a turning point. If you'd stayed, it became clear that the relationship couldn't be saved. You walked away, not with the same anguish as before, but with a newfound clarity and strength. This time, there was no doubt in your mind that you deserved better. If you'd already separated, the discovery was less about her and more about you. It was a reminder that moving on had been the right choice, even if it hadn't felt that way at first. You resolved to fully close that chapter of your life, focusing instead on the future you were building for yourself. The lesson in the betrayal. Twice betrayed, you learned that some people aren't capable of change, no matter how much you hope for it or work toward it. You learned the importance of boundaries, of listening to your intuition, and of trusting yourself to walk away when respect and honesty are no longer present. Most of all, you learned that betrayal, no matter how deep, doesn't define you. It's the choices you make afterward, how you heal, grow, and rebuild, that shape the person you become. And in those choices, you found a strength you never knew you had. The calm before the third storm life had moved forward once again, albeit with scars that served as constant reminders of the past. If you had stayed after the second betrayal, it was only because she had begged for one last chance, swearing on everything sacred that she had changed. Her words had been desperate, her promises heartfelt, and despite the lingering doubts, you allowed her one more opportunity to prove her sincerity. If you had parted ways, the betrayal felt distant now, like a storm that had finally passed. You interacted occasionally, especially if you had shared obligations like children, but you'd built walls around your heart. You were stronger now, or so you thought, a new name in the story. The gardener came into your life, or hers, quietly. If you were together, he was the man tending to your lawn, or the flowers she insisted would brighten the backyard. If you were separated, he was a figure she casually mentioned, someone helping her with landscaping at her new place. At first, he seemed like a footnote in your story, a peripheral character whose presence hardly registered. But then, just like before, the subtle changes began. Her demeanor shifted again. Excuses about needing time to clear her head, longer hours spent outdoors or away, and that unmistakable tension in her voice when you asked simple, direct questions. The familiarity of it all hit you like a cold wind. This wasn't your first time deciphering her hidden truths. The evidence. This time, it wasn't intuition alone that guided you. It was a text left open on her phone, a carelessly discarded note, or perhaps the way she lit up when his name came up, an excitement that seemed too familiar, too telling. Maybe you overheard a hushed conversation, her voice soft and conspiratorial in a way that made your stomach churn. The evidence, when it came, was damning. Texts that spoke of stolen moments, small tokens exchanged, a bracelet, a flower, and plans made in secrecy. The threads of their connection were woven so deeply that you couldn't deny it any longer. The breaking point. The confrontation came with a sense of inevitability. This wasn't anger or disbelief anymore. It was exhaustion, the weariness of someone who had been betrayed too many times to feel surprise. 3 times, you said, your voice calm but steely. 3 different men. Do you even understand what you've done? She couldn't meet your eyes. I don't know what's wrong with me, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I don't know why I keep doing this. Her confession didn't soften the blow. If anything, it made it worse. It wasn't about you or even the relationships she destroyed. It was about her, and her inability or unwillingness to face whatever void she was trying to fill. The end of the road. This time, there was no decision to make. Whether you were still together or had been apart, the realization was the same. She was broken in ways you couldn't fix, and her pattern of betrayal wasn't something you could endure any longer. If you were still married, you filed for divorce without hesitation. There was no room for reconciliation, no place for hope. The foundation of your relationship had crumbled beyond repair. If you had already separated, this betrayal became the final nail in the coffin of any lingering ties you felt. You severed all contact, setting boundaries that protected your newfound peace. Moving on. Truly this time, moving on felt different. It wasn't just about healing from betrayal, it was about reclaiming your life, free from the cycle of her deception. You sought support from friends, therapy, and your own inner strength, determined to build a life that wasn't defined by her actions. The betrayal, painful as it was, became a catalyst for growth. You began to see it not as a reflection of your worth, but as a testament to your resilience. Slowly, you rediscovered joy in new hobbies, new connections, and perhaps in time, new love. The lesson reinforced. Her third betrayal solidified what you'd already begun to understand. Some people are incapable of change, and it's not your job to save them. The only responsibility you have is to yourself, to guard your heart, honor your boundaries, and pursue the happiness you deserve. In the end, her actions didn't define you. They defined her. And your response? That defined the strength, wisdom, and courage you carried forward into the next chapter of your life. The Forgotten Shadows' 10 years is a lifetime in its own right. For Marcus, it was a decade built brick by brick, a shared home, countless nights of whispered dreams, and the quiet certainty that he and Emma were an unshakable team. But sometimes, Even the most solid foundations have cracks invisible to the naked eye. It began innocuously, as many profound revelations do. Marcus had been sorting through old photographs for their upcoming anniversary. They had always celebrated grandly, treating each milestone as a chance to remind each other why they had chosen this path together. A box of mementos, long stowed away in their attic, seemed a treasure trove of nostalgia. Among faded postcards and movie stubs, Marcus stumbled upon a receipt folded neatly in half. Dated 8 years prior, it was for a dinner at a high-end restaurant, one he distinctly remembered wanting to visit but never having the chance. Curiosity nudged him forward. The receipt listed 2 meals and a bottle of wine, an extravagance they hadn't indulged in that year. His name wasn't on the reservation. Emma's was. Shaking it off, Marcus reasoned it could have been an outing with a friend or a family member. Emma was thoughtful and often hosted such gatherings. Yet, a seed of doubt had taken root. Over the following days, Marcus's world subtly shifted. He began noticing patterns he had ignored. Emma's guarded phone, her occasional evasiveness when he inquired about her day, and a collection of business trips that seemed curiously timed with periods when their marriage felt distant. Marcus wasn't a man prone to paranoia. He prided himself on trust, a cornerstone of their relationship. But the seed had grown, sprouting tendrils that urged him to dig deeper. One evening when Emma was out, Marcus found himself staring at her old laptop, long forgotten and gathering dust. It was a violation of trust, and he hesitated, the weight of his actions pressing heavily on his chest. But the pull was undeniable. He powered it on, navigating through her emails and files. Most were mundane, as expected, but a folder labeled Travel Plans stood out. Inside were photos from trips Marcus had never been on. One image in particular struck him. A candid shot of Emma laughing in a cityscape he didn't recognize, her hand entwined with another man's. The date on the photo was 6 years ago, during one of her alleged business trips. His breath caught. A flood of emotions surged through him: betrayal, sorrow, confusion. Yet with each wave came clarity. He began piecing together moments he had once dismissed. Late-night phone calls she claimed were work-related, unexplained absences, and a growing emotional distance that he had attributed to the pressures of life. Confronting Emma was both the hardest and the most liberating moment of his life. He laid the evidence before her, his voice steady but heavy with heartbreak. She didn't deny it. Tears streamed down her face as she admitted to an affair that had ended years ago. She had chosen to stay, to rebuild, believing that her secret would remain buried and their life could continue as it was. For Marcus, the revelation was shattering. Yet in the ruins of what they had built, he found a strange sense of strength. He realized that trust, once broken, could never truly be the same. Their story didn't end with a dramatic separation or a cinematic reconciliation. Instead, it became a quiet, reflective journey for Marcus, a path of rediscovery and healing. In time, he learned to forgive, not for her sake, but for his own. He discovered that even the deepest wounds could lead to growth. And while their love story had fractured, it taught him one of life's most profound truths. Sometimes, letting go is the bravest thing you can do. The Forgotten Shadows. Part 3. The weeks following Emma's confession, Marcus felt like a man untethered. The life he thought he knew, the memories he cherished, had been rewritten, their edges frayed by betrayal. He moved into the guest room, needing space to sort through the chaos in his heart. Emma, too, seemed lost, a shadow of her once confident self. Their home became a quiet battleground, not of anger, but of unresolved emotions. For Marcus, healing was not linear. One moment, he felt a pang of longing for the woman he had built a life with, the woman who shared his dreams and sorrows. The next, resentment surged, a roaring tide that threatened to drown him. It was during one of his lowest moments that his best friend, Leo, insisted on a change of scenery. "Come with me to the lake house this weekend," Leo said. "Clear your head. You've been carrying this alone for too long." The lake house was a place of solace, tucked away in a quiet corner of the world. Its stillness was a balm to Marcus's frayed nerves. Sitting by the water, with nothing but the rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a bird, he began to reflect. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel every emotion: the grief, the anger, the guilt for not seeing the signs sooner. Leo, ever the pragmatist, asked him a question that lingered long after the trip ended. "Do you think you can ever forgive her? Not for her sake, but for your own?" Emma's struggle back at home, Emma had begun her own journey of reflection. She started therapy, confronting the choices that had led her down a path of secrecy and betrayal. The affair, she admitted to herself, had been less about the other man and more about her own struggles. Feelings of inadequacy, the fear of losing her identity in the cocoon of marriage. She wrote Marcus a letter, pouring out her heart. In it, she didn't ask for forgiveness, but instead offered clarity. She spoke of her love for him, a love that had always been real despite her actions. She admitted her failures and expressed her hope that, if nothing else, he would find peace. Crossroads. When Marcus returned from the lake house, he found the letter waiting for him. He read it in one sitting, then read it again. Her words were raw, vulnerable, and above all, honest. For the first time since the revelation, he saw her not as the woman who had betrayed him, but as a person, flawed, broken, and trying to make amends. They began to talk. The conversations were hard, often punctuated by tears and long silences, but they were also cathartic. Emma shared her fears, her regrets, and the steps she was taking to understand herself better. Marcus, in turn, voiced his pain, his doubts, and his uncertainty about their future. It was during one of these talks that Marcus realized something profound. While Emma's actions had shattered his trust, they had also laid bare the cracks that had existed long before the affair. They had both, in their own ways, neglected the deeper currents of their relationship, focusing instead on the surface. A new beginning months turned into a year. Marcus and Emma decided to part ways, not out of anger or bitterness, but out of mutual understanding. Their love, while real, had been irreparably changed. They sold the house, dividing their belongings and memories with surprising ease. Marcus moved into a small apartment in the city, a space that was entirely his own. He took up painting, a hobby he had abandoned years ago, finding solace in the swirl of colors and the rhythm of the brush. Emma, too, found her path, working with a local charity and building a life grounded in self-awareness and purpose. They remained in contact, not as lovers, but as two people who had shared something significant. Occasionally, they met for coffee, their conversations tinged with the warmth of old friends rather than the ache of lost partners. For Marcus, the experience became a chapter, not the defining one, but an important one. He learned that life, like a shadow, shifts with the light, and that even in darkness, there is the potential for growth and clarity. And as he stood one day before a blank canvas, he felt a flicker of hope, a reminder that while some stories end, others are waiting to begin. The Forgotten Shadows, Part 3. The end of Marcus and Emma's marriage marked the beginning of two separate journeys. While they had parted with understanding, the transition to a new life was far from easy. The echoes of their shared past lingered, occasionally surfacing in moments of solitude or reflection. Marcus's resurgence. Marcus's new apartment became his sanctuary. At first it felt hollow, a stark contrast to the warmth and familiarity of the home he once shared with Emma. But over time, he infused it with his personality, filling it with art supplies, books, and plants. He found unexpected joy in tending to them, their steady growth a quiet metaphor for his own healing. Painting became more than a pastime. It became a way for Marcus to process his emotions. His early works were dark, heavy with somber tones and jagged strokes that mirrored his turmoil. But as months passed, color began to seep into his canvases, soft blues, vibrant yellows, and serene greens. He painted landscapes, abstract forms, and occasionally fleeting memories of his life with Emma. Each stroke was a step forward, a reclaiming of his identity. One evening, at the insistence of a friend, Marcus submitted one of his pieces to a local gallery's open exhibition. To his surprise, it was accepted. On the night of the event, as he stood among strangers admiring his work, he felt a quiet pride he hadn't experienced in years. The gallery owner approached him, offering to showcase more of his pieces in the future. For the first time, Marcus saw a path he hadn't considered, a career in art. Emma's journey was equally transformative. Therapy became a cornerstone of her life, helping her unravel the insecurities and fears that had driven her to betray Marcus's trust. She learned to confront her flaws, not with self-loathing, but with a determination to grow. Her work with the charity became a source of fulfillment. She helped organize food drives, mentored at-risk youth, and spearheaded initiatives for women seeking to rebuild their lives after difficult circumstances. In their stories, she saw reflections of her own struggles, and in helping them, she found a sense of purpose. One day, during a charity event, Emma was approached by a woman who had been through a painful divorce. They spoke candidly, the woman sharing her fears of being judged, and Emma offering her own hard-earned insights. By the end of their conversation, the woman hugged Emma, thanking her for her honesty and understanding. It was a small moment, but it solidified Emma's commitment to living authentically. The unexpected reunion. 2 years after their separation, Marcus and Emma crossed paths unexpectedly at a bookstore. Both had changed in subtle ways. Marcus's once cautious demeanor had been replaced with quiet confidence, and Emma's eyes held a clarity he hadn't seen in years. Their conversation began tentatively, but as they spoke, the old familiarity returned. They shared updates about their lives, Marcus's burgeoning art career, Emma's work with the charity, and the ways they had grown. There was no bitterness, no resentment, only an undercurrent of gratitude for the roles they had played in each other's lives. As they parted ways, Emma handed Marcus a flyer for an upcoming charity art auction. "If you're interested," she said with a smile, "I think your work would fit perfectly." A full-circle moment. Months later, Marcus stood in a crowded hall, his paintings displayed alongside those of other artists. The auction was a success, raising funds for the very organization Emma had dedicated herself to. Toward the end of the evening, she approached him, her expression a mixture of pride and nostalgia. "Your work is incredible," she said. "I always knew you had it in you." Marcus smiled, the weight of their shared history now a gentle memory rather than a burden. "And you," he replied, "have found your calling." In that moment, they weren't ex-partners mourning a lost relationship. They were two individuals who had grown, healed, and found their paths. Their story, once marked by betrayal and pain, had become one of transformation and mutual respect. The lesson of shadows. As Marcus left the auction, he looked up at the night sky, the stars scattered like flecks of paint on a canvas. He thought of the shadows that had once consumed him and how they had given way to light. Life, he realized, was not about avoiding darkness, but learning to navigate it, to find beauty in its contrasts. Emma, too, stood outside, watching him go. She felt no sadness, only a deep sense of gratitude. Their chapter together had ended, but it had given birth to new stories, stories of resilience, forgiveness, and the boundless potential for growth. And so, the shadows faded, leaving behind a canvas filled with the vibrant hues of a life rediscovered. The Forgotten Shadows. Part 4. The case of the tainted vows. Marcus had always been a man of habit. Even after the storm that tore through his life 2 years ago, he found comfort in routine. His morning coffee, his quiet studio hours, his evening walks through the bustling streets of the city. But something had shifted. A gnawing unease crept into his life, a whisper in the dark corners of his mind. It began with an envelope slipped under his door. The clue. The envelope was plain, its contents unassuming at first glance. Inside was a single photograph. Emma, his ex-wife, walking arm in arm with a man Marcus didn't recognize. The picture was old, judging by the fashion and the slightly faded edges, but it wasn't the date that caught his eye. It was the location. A hotel he distinctly remembered from their shared past. The handwriting on the back was sharp and angular, almost mechanical. It read, "She never stopped lying." Marcus's heart sank. He thought he had buried the past, but here it was, clawing its way back. His first instinct was to dismiss it as a cruel prank. But as he held the photograph, a spark of curiosity ignited. If someone had gone through the trouble to dig this up, maybe there was more to uncover. The investigation begins. Marcus wasn't a detective, but he had a sharp mind and a penchant for puzzles, traits he honed in his art. He started with the photograph, scrutinizing every detail. The hotel in the background had a distinctive sign, the Holloway Grand. It was a name he hadn't heard in years, but it rang a bell. He recalled Emma mentioning it once, claiming it was where her company hosted a conference during their 5th anniversary. Pulling out an old journal, Marcus found the date Emma had referenced. The timeline aligned too neatly with one of her business trips. A cold realization crept in. This might have been one of the times she betrayed him, but who sent the photograph? And why now? The Holloway connection. The next day, Marcus made his way to the Holloway Grand. The hotel had aged since the photograph was taken, but its opulence was unmistakable. He approached the front desk with a fabricated story about writing a piece on the hotel's history, hoping to gain access to old records. The receptionist, a young man eager to please, led Marcus to the archives. After an hour of sifting through guest logs, Marcus found what he was looking for. Emma's name, listed alongside a man named Richard Keene. The date matched exactly. The name wasn't familiar, but it gave him a lead. With a bit of digging, Marcus discovered that Richard Keene was a mid-level executive at a company Emma's firm had partnered with years ago. He also found something else, a series of online articles mentioning Richard's recent promotion to CEO. One article featured a picture of him with a headline that stopped Marcus cold. The man behind the rise of Horizon Global. Horizon Global was the charity Emma now worked for. The confrontation Marcus felt the pieces clicking into place, but the picture they painted was murky. Was Emma still involved with Richard? Or was this just another ghost from the past? He decided to confront Emma, knowing full well that the answers might reopen wounds he thought had healed. When he arrived at her office, Emma was surprised to see him. They hadn't spoken much since the auction months ago, but her warmth toward him hadn't waned. Marcus wasted no time, pulling out the photograph and laying it on her desk. "Care to explain?" he asked, his voice calm but steely. Emma's expression shifted. Confusion, recognition, then something Marcus couldn't quite place. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "That's not the answer I'm looking for," Marcus replied. "Why are you with him, Emma? And why does someone think I need to know?" Emma leaned back, her face pale. "Marcus, this was years ago. Richard, he was part of my life during the affair. But it ended before I confessed to you. I haven't spoken to him since." Marcus studied her. Her words seemed genuine, but the timing of the photograph's arrival made him suspicious. Then why is his name tied to Horizon Global? Why do I feel like I'm being pulled into something I don't understand? Emma hesitated before answering. Richard is a donor, a major one. I've avoided him at every event, but I can't control his involvement. He's persistent. A shadowy messenger leaving Emma's office. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that someone was orchestrating this. The photograph, the cryptic message, it was too deliberate. That night, as he sifted through his thoughts, another envelope appeared under his door. This time, it contained a note. Ask her about the Lisbon contract. The reference was meaningless to Marcus, but he knew it wasn't to Emma. A web of deceit. The next day, Marcus returned to Emma, note in hand. The mention of Lisbon visibly shook her. How do you know about that? She whispered. You tell me, Marcus said. It seems like someone wants me to dig up every skeleton in your closet. Emma's shoulders slumped. The Lisbon contract was Richard's leverage. He helped my company secure a deal in exchange for my compliance. I thought I had buried it. Marcus, I don't know who's doing this, but it's not me. The revelation was staggering. Marcus realized this wasn't just about their past. It was about Emma's present. Someone was trying to destroy her and, by extension, drag him into the fallout. A decision. Marcus had a choice. Walk away and let Emma face the consequences of her actions, or step back into the shadows to uncover the truth. Despite everything, he knew he couldn't abandon her. If the past had taught him anything, it was that no one should face their demons alone. And so, Marcus began piecing together the threads of a deeper mystery, one that stretched beyond betrayal and into the heart of power, manipulation, and redemption. What began as a personal quest for closure was now a case of survival, and Marcus was determined to find the truth, no matter the cost. The Forgotten Shadows, Part 5, A Rekindling. Flame. The revelation of Emma's connection to Richard had left Marcus in a haze of conflicted emotions. Despite the lingering mistrust, there was an undeniable pull between them, a current neither had acknowledged in the years since their separation. The investigation into the mystery had forced them into close quarters, and with it came the reawakening of old, unresolved feelings. That evening, as they sat together in Emma's apartment, the tension between them was palpable. Marcus had come over under the guise of discussing the latest clue, the cryptic note about the Lisbon contract. Yet, the quiet space between their words spoke of something far more personal. A spark, rekindled. Emma poured 2 glasses of wine, setting one in front of Marcus before settling into the seat opposite him. The warm light of the room softened the sharp lines of her face, and for a moment, Marcus found himself remembering the Emma he had first fallen in love with. The woman who could light up a room with her laughter, who once had been his world. Do you regret it? Marcus asked, suddenly, his voice low. Everything we went through? Emma's gaze flickered, and she took a sip of her wine before answering. Every day, she admitted. Not because of how it ended, but because of what I lost. With you. The honesty in her words disarmed him. For so long he had thought of her as the architect of his heartbreak, but here she was, stripped of pretense, bearing her own wounds. Why didn't you tell me about Richard before? He pressed gently. Emma sighed, setting her glass down. Because I didn't want to hurt you any more than I already had. And because part of me hoped I could leave it all behind. But it seems the past has a way of finding us. Crossing the threshold. The air between them thickened, charged with unspoken emotions. Marcus reached for his glass, their fingers brushing briefly as Emma did the same. The contact was electric, a spark that ignited something long buried. Emma hesitated, her breath hitching. Marcus, she began, but her voice faltered. He met her gaze, his eyes dark and searching. Do you want me to leave? He asked. though the intensity in his voice betrayed his own desires. "No," she said softly, almost a whisper. It was all the encouragement he needed. Slowly, Marcus leaned forward, closing the distance between them. Their lips met in a tentative kiss, a mingling of caution and longing. It was not the fiery passion of youth, but something deeper, an aching need to bridge the chasm that had grown between them, an intimate reunion. The kiss deepened, and Emma's hands found their way to Marcus's shoulders, pulling him closer. They moved to the couch, their bodies entwined as years of suppressed desire spilled over. Her fingers traced the lines of his face, as if memorizing him anew, while his hands explored the familiar curves of her body, rediscovering what had once been his refuge. It was a slow, deliberate unraveling. Each touch, each kiss, carried the weight of their shared history, the love they had once known, the pain they had endured, and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, there was something still worth salvaging. In the soft glow of the room, they shed their barriers, both physical and emotional. Marcus kissed the hollow of Emma's neck, drawing a shiver from her, while her hands roamed his back, pulling him closer as if afraid he might disappear. Their movements were unhurried, reverent, as they reacquainted themselves with the rhythm they had once shared. A moment of vulnerability. Afterward, they lay tangled in each other's arms, the quiet hum of the city outside their only accompaniment. Marcus brushed a strand of hair from Emma's face, his gaze thoughtful. "Where do we go from here?" he asked, his voice heavy with uncertainty. Emma pressed her forehead to his, her fingers trailing along his chest. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I do know this. What we had was real, Marcus, and what we just shared, it still is." For the first time in years, Marcus allowed himself to believe her. In that moment, they were no longer defined by their past mistakes, but by the possibility of a future neither had dared to imagine.